Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for yet another Conservative Home Fringe event, this one time in partnership with Age UK, and what's set to be a fantastic panel and fascinating discussion bringing together two of the most apposite and essential political and social issues on the nation's agenda, and certainly one occupying the Conservative Party's mind, thinking back to the last election, which obviously delivered such remarkable results, but also thinking forward 4 and a bit years to the next election. So we're here to discuss social care and beyond, delivering for older voters in the Red Wall. And it won't be a surprise to any of you as Conservative Home readers and viewers of the party conference today that, of course, the Red Wall has become a dominant theme in our politics. There were, speaking as a native of the northeast of England, there were some of us who've been writing for a few years that Labour's institutions and establishment, the dominance in various parts of the north of England in particular, had become hollowed out and actually become a quite an unstable facade. In retrospect, if we look all the way back even to the 2004 regional assembly referendum in the northeast, when you had that region chosen as a place where the then government thought it would have great sway to win that vote. It deployed a huge amount of political capital and ministers, and when the people of the North East effectively said no to a proposal from an extremely popular Labour government, looking back, that feels almost like it may have been one of the first signs of what happened in the 2019 election with the crumbling of the Red Wall. It's worth noting, of course, that the architect of the No campaign in the 2004 regional assembly referendum was one Dominic Cummings, which may or may not be a coincidence, depending on your analysis. The panel may have some thoughts on that. But of course, having won these seats, having gained them, having seen so many other former Labour strongholds become so close and become marginals in the way they haven't been, in some cases, ever before, there's a huge focus, understandably, within the Conservative Party on how to retain those seats at the next election. And also, for that matter, if it found itself on the front foot by the time of the next election, how it might gain some other marginals. But none of these seats exist as just playing cards on a table. None of them are just hypothetical battlefields for political conflict. In reality, of course, every constituency is decided by the feelings, the concerns, the hopes, the fears, and the personal experience and the day-to-day lives of the people who live there. And that, of course, must underlie any political assessment of how whether the Red Wall may have temporarily gone blue, or whether it may continue to change further in future. And looming extremely large for years now, remaining unresolved under governments of all parties, is the huge structural issues and the huge institutional and policy issues we see in terms of social care, something that's been brought into devastating relief this year of all years. And we know what the party said at the last election about social care. We know what many voters are concerned about, very concerned about it, not only for their own care, but also for the well-being of their loved ones, their neighbours and their fellow citizens. And we know, of course, that many people who are actually users of the social care system face a great many challenges themselves in being able to access it and getting the support and care that they need. And it's for that reason that Conservative Home and Age UK have partnered on this particular event, to be able to have a discussion that explores all of these different facets of this essential topic. We're joined today by a really brilliant panel to give us a lot of those, to analyse this issue from all those different angles. Dehenna Davison, the MP for Bishop Auckland, will be well known to many of you. You've probably seen her lip syncing to some Taylor Swift in a viral video on Twitter in the last couple of days. But she's famous for many, many other things, not least becoming one of those fantastic Tees Valley seat-winning MPs who we saw make that historic journey down the East Coast main line in their blue scarves to take their seats after the election. Deborah Mattinson is a founding partner of BritainThinks, a hugely experienced pollster and expert in public opinion, messaging and political strategy. For a long time advised the Labour Party, and has also written Beyond the Red Wall, a fascinating book I'd recommend to you, on exactly this topic. And of course, we're joined as well by Caroline Abrahams, the charity director of Age UK, a charity which does so much important work, both with people in need, people who require support, people who are using these kind of services, but also in terms of the public policy discussion on the topics we're here to talk about today. So that's probably more than enough from me, frankly. Please welcome our first guest, the new MP for Bishop Auckland.
Well, thank you very much, Mark, for that very warm introduction. And I think this is a really, really key issue that, you know, as a party, we need to get on top of, but much more so than that. This is not just a party political issue. This is a huge social issue that I think cross-party is something we all need to be working on to make sure that we've got a social care structure that is really fit for purpose and works for everyone right across the country. So for me, I think there are three sort of key issues we need to be thinking about. The first is homes, the second is incomes, and the third is loneliness and the mental health factor. So on homes, I mean, there are two kind of key factors. The first is obviously making sure that older people are able to easily downsize, which is something that, whilst probably not as much a factor up in the Red Wall, is still something that is worthy of consideration. I know I've had conversations with a few residents in some of my smaller villages who are desperate to downsize, struggling to find decent accommodation to move into. And, you know, we have so many young families who want to stay there, stay in the village that they grew up in, and are struggling to find that accommodation. So in that sense, it's not just an issue that affects older voters, it's an issue that affects everyone right across the age spectrum, from young families right up the board. So making sure that we've got the right incentives in there for people to be able to sell their homes and downsize without it costing them an arm and a leg through stamp duty is really important. But secondly, it's also about making sure that we've got good quality housing, which is something that certainly in my neck of the woods is a huge consideration for we as policymakers. So making sure that we've got housing that is fit for purpose, but also supported housing for people as they get towards that sort of later period in their lives. The second key thing is incomes. And as we know, you know, there are a lot of people out there who have great sort of private pension pots that help support them as they move through their lives. But we also know there are an awful lot of people who don't, where the vast majority of their pension income comes from that state pension. So making sure that we get that right. And if we promise that we're going to keep a triple lock, then sticking to that promise and keeping that triple lock in place is really important. We know that there are about 2 million pensioners out there living in poverty. So we need to do whatever we can to support them. So when you hear things like, you know, the TV licence might be scrapped, I think it's something that's absolutely atrocious and something we really, really need to keep in place. But also making sure that pensioners know what it is that they're entitled to. So I think it's something like there are 2 in 5 eligible pensioners eligible for pension credit don't claim anything. We need to be out there selling those messages, letting them know that exactly what benefits they are eligible for, helping them claim them in the easiest, simplest way possible, to make sure people are getting what it is they're entitled to help support them with their incomes. And that kind of ties in a little bit to not just personal incomes, but also council incomes and local government incomes, because we have a major issue in County Durham in particular, whereby the current funding formulas don't really fit and work for us. We see that because we've got sort of a half urban, half rural population, we don't tend to benefit from either of the two pots of money. So whenever we need additional money to help provide those rural care services, for example, we often lose out because we have urban centres. And when we need some of those deprivation grants, we can miss out on those because we have a vast rural belt as well. So I think that's something that we really need to look at fixing if we are going to fix the social care crisis. And then the third point is loneliness, which I think is a much more difficult challenge for us to meet. I know sort of in my patch, we played our little part from my office when COVID hit, making sure that we had people on hand to, you know, go and deliver basic essentials for people who were shielding. But we also set up a dedicated phone line so that anyone who was really feeling the difficulty of, you know, not having a face-to-face conversation could have someone that they could speak to. We also had a great dedicated counsellor who was working with us to try and provide a little bit of that talking support as well. But how we tackle that is going to be a major issue moving forward. But I think the most important thing that we need to remember is that these sort of issues, these issues that affect older people, don't just affect older people, they affect everyone. Because if you know that your mum or your grandma is struggling, that is also having an impact on you and on your family in trying to support them. So I think we need to make sure that we're not sort of segregating this debate to say it's only issues that affect older people. It affects us right across the board.
Certainly, and I think that that in particular is an absolutely essential point. The fact is that I think it's quite easy sometimes for people who are talking, as I said earlier, about policy as hypothetical, or of politics as a board game of some sort, that actually they forget that these things are directly interconnected. In the same way that many older voters care very strongly about jobs for young people, for example, because they're part of a community, they're part of families, they're grandchildren and children. So thank you very much for that. Now, our next guest, as I mentioned earlier, Deborah Mattinson. Really, my introduction earlier, if anything, underplayed the depth of Deborah's expertise in political research and opinion polling, and in studying what people think and why and how, and also, always key interest to politicians and policymakers, what might change their minds about things, what might make them less pleased or more pleased about something. I really can't recommend enough her new book, which is a stark and frank discussion of some of the issues that have emerged politically in recent years in the Red Wall. So please join me. It would be a big round of applause in a real world conference, but we'll have to just imagine that, Deborah. You can keep it echoing. Please welcome Deborah Mattinson.
Great, thank you very much, Mark. That's a really lovely introduction. So I'm going to talk, first of all, a little bit about the Red Wall itself, because, as you've said, I spent a lot of time in various constituencies there earlier this year doing research for the book. And in fact, I've been back there very recently and re-interviewed some of the people. And to your point, actually, one of the things I do in the book is to explore what Labour needs to do to win back those voters, and also what the Conservatives need to do to keep them. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Then specifically about older voters there, who they are, and then what they care about, and looking at issues like social care, finance, and so on. And then just some very short thoughts about what next. So firstly then, a bit about the Red Wall. It's 4.7 million people. I think when we talk about it, it's easy to lose track of actually just how many people it is. And 2/3 of the 60 seats that Labour lost back in December were actually in the Red Wall. And a lot of them had never been anything but Labour. I mean, Bishop Auckland, for example, had been Labour at every election, bare one, since 1918, and Dehenna now enjoys an 8,000 majority. So pretty seismic shift. Are the people there so different? Obviously, you can't lump a group of people like that, 4.7 million people together in that way. But the answer is anyway that everybody I spoke to in the Red Wall wants exactly the same that everybody else wants. We all want the same things. We all want decent housing. Jen's talked about that. We want decent jobs. We want a secure retirement. We want a future for our children. But I would say that in some parts of the Red Wall, particularly, people find it harder to achieve those things than they do in many other parts of the country. And as such, they feel somewhat resentful. So why do they feel that? Well, they believe that their areas have been neglected. And frankly, the evidence I saw with my own eyes when I was up there suggests that they're not wrong. But they are all people that have very proud pasts. And the areas that I went to, I focused on Darlington with its wonderful tradition of railways, Hyndburn, which, for instance, was the home to the Norrie brick, which the Eiffel Tower is built with, and Stoke, of course, the home to the potteries. So incredibly proud pasts, but very uncertain futures. A lot of the things that are wrong you can see around you as you walk around rundown high streets. Now, everybody says that they have a rundown high street, but there's a correlation here that's quite interesting, which is that everywhere I went, and in fact, my research showed that everywhere, people had lost their Marks and Spencer. This is a really important symbol because it shows you that there isn't anything nice in that place. One woman said, if I want to buy something special, there's nowhere to buy it from. If I want to get a nice pair of knickers, there's nowhere to go. So it's a sort of symbol of the good things being taken out of your area. Poor nighttime economy, antisocial behaviour, city centres becoming no-go areas, town centres becoming no-go areas at night, nothing for children to do. And the economy based on much more fragile, low-paid sectors, so retail, hospitality, and much less on the higher paid sectors like communications, finance, technology, that have really shored up other parts of the country. And people are less well qualified too, so fewer than a quarter have degrees compared with a third of the population as a whole. So really quick sort of romp through the area. Then what about older people? So in fact, red wall seats, when you take them as a whole, tend to be middle-aged rather than older, but that does make them older than other constituencies. And they share a lot of the concerns and priorities of typically older voters. So 55% of the people that switched from Labour to Conservative were over 55, which I think explains the real focus on older people. And frankly, it's hard to see how either Labour or Conservatives could win without winning substantially in the red wall and without winning over substantially these older voters. So it's not just the red wall, I think, that shifts centre stage, but it's older voters that shift centre stage. So what else are the older voters like? Well, 2/3 of voters in the red wall voted leave, and that proportion gets much higher if you look at older voters. They are very patriotic. We were just admiring the flag with the fairy lights around in Dehenna's office. She hits the nail on the head here, and any red wall voters watching will also appreciate it. There is a very strong identification with local communities. Fewer people, for instance, travel any distance to get to work, but much stronger resentment, really strong resentment towards London and the South. And basically the people that I spoke to frankly felt let down by all politicians. And the women were often the hardest hit. They're more likely to be on benefits, they're more likely to be working in multiple insecure jobs, and they're very often carers. So for example, one of the people I met was a woman called Penny, who was a foster parent. She worked a 6-day week as a carer also. And then on her day off, what did she do? She cared for her own nan. So, you know, that was not an untypical story, I would say. So a little bit about care then, social care. Although awareness of social care as a thing is growing, it's still not top of mind, and it's not described as such. It's often just seen, and I found this in the Red Wall, where so many of the women I spoke to were carers. It's just something that women do. It's just what you do if you're a woman. It's a bit like the levelling up vocabulary. The idea of it is understood, but it's not vocabulary that's used. It's increasingly, though, a worry, because one thing that's happening in Red Wall seats is that the younger generation are leaving the area for work, which leaves a bit of a gap, because if there isn't something formal to do social care, who's going to do it if family aren't around to take it on? And there's a really strong sense that it's not working well, which COVID-19 has obviously highlighted. And increasingly, we find people in focus groups we're doing talking about care homes as being just forgotten institutions, forgotten by government, forgotten by everybody. There's a lot of support for a system that's free to use, but quite a lot of resistance to the idea of taxes going up. And red wallers always presume it's going to be them that's going to pay. They think they will pay disproportionately. They think that they are least able to do so and that they will end up footing the bill. And there's a widespread sense, which is really damning, and I think definitely something for this government to grapple with, that it's a topic that Conservatives keep kicking into the long grass. There's some awareness that it's a promise that Boris Johnson has made, but it's treated like a lot of the promises now that he makes, which is a bit of a pinch of salt. What else? Finances. Red wallers are less well off generally. The Resolution Foundation have done some interesting analysis, which I would suggest, if you're interested, you look at. It's on their website. Most recently, they published some work this weekend showing that red wallers lose out more than most from changes to universal benefit. And a survey conducted earlier this year showed that red wallers were not in favour of higher income tax across the board, although the exception might be to fund the NHS, but they do want the system to be fairer, and for businesses and the very well off to pay more, with adjustments made to capital gains tax and pension tax relief for top earners. COVID, another big issue, where red wall communities have been particularly hard hit by COVID. More insecure employment, they're more likely to be doing jobs that mean that they can't work comfortably and safely from home, likely higher unemployment, more poverty, poorer health, and a greater sense of isolation. And many of the lockdowns, local lockdowns that we've seen, have been in red wall constituencies. So I went back this week and last week and just talked to people who had switched from Labour to the Tories. I found that a lot of people had done so partly because they were very big fans of Boris Johnson himself, who's attributed with de-snobifying the Tories and enabling them to vote Tory for the first time. But now the disappointment's palpable. As one person said to me, we voted for bold and we've ended up with waffle. So finally, and I'll end with this, what do Red Wallers want to happen next? I think first and foremost, they want to be wooed. Labour took their loyalty for granted and they've now discovered their political power. And I found this everywhere I went, where there's sudden awareness that actually they mattered. They never felt they mattered before. And I think they're going to be quite demanding in the future. They've got high expectations for a better future and better funding in their own areas and their communities. They think the government is going to deliver that. They think Brexit will help it along. And most of all, they're quite optimistic and hopeful. And that, again, was something that Boris Johnson brought to them. And they think that maybe, just maybe, this is their time. But the jury is very much out. So perhaps if I leave it there.
You say leave it there, Deborah. There's a huge amount there for us to be getting our teeth into and trying to get our heads around. One thing, I can already see questions flowing in from the audience. I should say, ladies and gentlemen, watching at home, whether you're watching on the party conference platform or via Zoom, do use the Q&A button and put your questions in for the panel, because I think that what Deborah just said illustrates quite how many different aspects of this topic there are and how important they all are. And for that reason, I'm very glad to welcome our next guest, the charity director of Age UK, our event partner who made this event possible. Caroline Abrahams is a barrister, she's a social scientist, she's somebody who has a very long track record of advising people in civil service and in policymakers in public life. But really the thread, reading her CV, that runs through her career is that she's somebody who never seeks out an easy or unchallenging thing to do. She seeks out places where there are changes that can and must be made. And I think her work with Age UK in recent years has shown her capacity for that. And very sadly, the circumstances of 2020 and what we've seen in recent months, particularly in the field that her charity deals with, shows the scale of the challenge that she and her organisation are taking on themselves. And that's why it's fantastic to be working with Age UK today on this, and why we're very glad to be joined by Caroline. Over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Mark. I'll try and live up to that. I'm not sure I can. And thanks very much too to our other panelists. And I wanted to sort of start off where Deborah left us, which is that she was pointing out that many people living in the Red Wall are conscious of their identity now and waiting for politicians to woo them. So as far as older voters are concerned, what might that look like? What would make a difference to older people living in these places, which, as both our previous speakers have pointed out, and Mark too, they're not all the same. They're quite diverse. There's some rurality, there's some big city, there's everything in between. But we do know some things about the older people living there, and Deborah said some things about that, and we've had a look too from Age UK to try and understand more. And I think in many ways, you'd say actually this is a bit like England as a whole, minus the affluent bits that level it up to a very high income. If you look at typically who might live in these places, often people who haven't got a huge amount of money, haven't got a lot of wealth and don't have very high incomes, lower than average incomes in later life, quite dependent, more dependent than most parts of the country and the average on the state pension, which is still, even despite the triple lock, only worth about 8,000 a year. So it's not a lavish amount to try and live on year after year. And also on those other benefits that come along with it if you're on a low income. Pension credit was mentioned, but also the free bus pass, the winter fuel allowance, and the late lamented free TV license, which has now gone. But we hope and will come back in one guise or other sooner or later. The other thing we know about older people living in these places is that typically they're not as well in later life as some other people in other parts of the country. They have disabilities, they are coping with ill health for a longer period towards the end of their lives. and they have more unmet need for care. Now, a lot of people might be surprised to learn that of all the people, older people in England who've got a need for care, actually 1.6 million, that's the latest figure we have, haven't got all those needs met. That means that they're not getting the state services they need, but they're not always getting help from families or friends either. These are people who are struggling on with some kind of infirmity where they really would like help with things like getting out of bed or getting in and out of the shower, things like that. But actually, in parts of the Red Wall, the numbers who have these sorts of needs and who aren't getting help are that much higher again. Actually, 2/3 of people in the northeast with some need for care have got some of it unmet. So that's why, in particular, we decided to spotlight social care for the report that we produced, which I hope Mark will help us to promote to people who've been kind enough to join this conversation. But it's also available from the Age UK website, and you'll see it, I think, promoted by us on social media through the day. So social care really does matter in this area. There are more than the usual number of carers, that's family and friends who are picking up the reins and helping their families themselves. Now that can be a very good thing, of course. We're not against carers. I'm a carer for my mum myself. It's a very understandable human reaction. And most people who care do it willingly, of course. But sometimes people are caring because there isn't a service that they can call on. And sometimes, particularly at the moment with COVID, this is another thing we're finding through all our research and talking to older people, carers are being rather left to carry the can on their own. There's less support from other services. Typically, for example, quite often, maybe an older person will go to a lunch club or a day centre one day a week. Now, that's good for them. It gives them some social interaction with others, but it's also good for their carer because, you know, that gives them a chance to have a breather, put their feet up and perhaps catch up with all the other things they haven't been able to do. All those services at the moment have closed, and a lot of them aren't coming back, sadly, because they've gone bust or there's not the money to sustain them. And the amount of council funding, which Dehenna referred to, supports those typically, but there isn't enough always to go round. There's a real problem about underfunding of care. So social care is a big problem in this area throughout, really. It's a problem throughout the whole country, but it does disproportionately seem to us to hit the Red Wall. And I think a lot of people listening into this will probably be aware that there's been some conversation about the possibility of a cap. And that's recognising that if you're unlucky enough to have to pay for your own care, and actually almost everybody does, I mean, an awful lot of people do now, because you have to have very big needs and have very little money to get any state help. If you end up paying for your own care, it can cost an awful lot of money. And so the idea was promoted a few years ago about capping that amount so no one would have to pay over a certain amount. There's a chap called Andrew Dilnott was asked to do some work on that, very renowned English economist. And he came up with a scheme which would have capped the amount that any of us had to pay. But the problem is, when we looked in detail at Age UK, at how that would work in the Red Wall, what we found was that people there would end up paying for their own care for an awful lot longer than people in lots of other parts of the country. And it wouldn't really be a very good deal for those people. And of course, actually too, there are fewer homeowners in the Red Wall than there are, for example, in the south of England. So our advice to any policymaker, regardless of party, is if you want to help the Red Wall, don't do the cap, or at least don't do the cap on its own. Because an awful lot of people in the Red Wall won't benefit from it. If that's what you want to do, benefit the Red Wall, a cap won't really help you. Another problem in the Red Wall, and in lots of other parts of the country too, is there's just not enough good care to go around. If you're looking for care for yourself or a loved one, you might well find that there's nowhere nearby, particularly a problem in rural areas. I think Deanna pointed that out. But even in towns, you know, care providers come and go. They quite often go bust. There's a lot of churn. There aren't enough staff either. And so even if you've got money to buy care, you might find you can't. There's none to be had. And the other problem with the cap is it doesn't bring new provision in. So we really need something that's much more comprehensive, rather like some other countries have done, which means it works a bit more like the NHS. I'm just going to finish with one word about the NHS, which is, gosh, it's important. It's, of course, every politician knows that, regardless of party. And it's all the more important at the moment, of course, with COVID. But really, if you think about the older people living in the Red Wall with more years of infirmity, more disability, and not very much money, having a good GP, having good local health services, having reliable district nurses, having a hospital that has clinics on that you can go to if you have, you know, ongoing ill health that lots and lots of older people have, that's tremendously important. And I think one of the speakers talked about security in later life. That is tremendously important to every older person, just not having to worry so much for the future. So our advice to politicians is, if you want to woo the red wall and the older voter, which is to take Deborah's phrase, then I would look very hard at supporting the NHS, investing in it, making sure it's working really well for older people. Yes, keep the triple lock, and let's try and get the state pension up, because £8,000 a year is not a lot to live on. And last but absolutely not least, please live up to the promises that actually be made by lots of different politicians in all parties about social care. It may not be talked about very much, but underneath it makes a huge difference to how secure older people feel, and of course their families. And really, in the red wall, it's probably the biggest issue where you could really transform older people's lives.
Thank you very much, Caroline. And before I go to audience questions, which is continuing to come in at the moment, I want to pick up on something you just mentioned, the disparities in terms of people's health and well-being between different parts of the country in later life. Is there a degree to which there are, whether it's, say, the NHS or parts of local government adult social care, or or the charity sector, among others, who could do and how could they do it to help to keep people healthier for longer, to help to prevent people getting to the point at which their needs require them to go into, for example, residential care, or to get into some of the, as you said, some of the quite already challenged services that we're talking about?
Yeah, that's a really big question, isn't it, Mark? And it's a really important one too. With care, actually, it's impossible to predict really whether someone's going to have care needs in later life or not. And actually, the irony is that sometimes people who've been incredibly fit throughout their lives, have really looked after themselves, live a long time, and then develop care needs towards the end of their life, whereas someone perhaps who hasn't done so well might die much younger without them. So there isn't a lot we can do, I think, to prevent ourselves from getting care needs. But on the health side, I think very much where you end up in later life, it's true with money too, is a product of what's happened throughout the rest of your life. So it's never too early with those key messages to children and young people about living well, not smoking, looking after yourself, taking exercise. Those are tremendously important, and they do have an impact. But of course, you've got to have the money to be able to afford to look after yourself well. And it's really, as Deborah said, it's much easier to do that if you're somebody with a good income, with a job that doesn't expose you to risk, where you're not under a lot of stress, or a sort of stress that comes from wondering where the next pound's going to come from. So actually, it's a kind of whole picture. We've all got a role to play in it. Charities have, as you say, councils, definitely the NHS. And it's what sort of society we want to build that allows people to live really good lives, and then they'll get all the good things from that when they get older.
Dehenna, can I bring you in on that, please? Because it's something that presumably you must see when you're out and about in your constituency, meeting people, some of these concerns, and the lifelong some of the lifelong inequalities that accrue during people's lives.
Well, completely, and I think Caroline made a really good point there about jobs, because what we find is that across the Red Wall in general, there are people in more sort of manual work, much more so than you see in more affluent areas, where it tends to be much more kind of office based and that sort of thing, which obviously does tend to have an impact on people's longer term kind of health outcomes. I think you're dead right though, Caroline, that it is never too early to live a healthy lifestyle, and that's something that we need to be promoting right from the get-go, right in schools. I know it's happening to some extent. Sometimes I do cringe a little bit at the nanny statism of it sometimes, when you see schools kind of really enforcing packed lunch rules. But we know that these things really do count from a young age. So making sure that people are kind of aware of the choices they're making from an early age is really important. But it is difficult. It is difficult sort of trying to figure out how to address this without bringing every single sort of stakeholder group in. So that means bringing in local NHS groups, it means bringing in councils, it means bringing in charities. And for we politicians, it's about listening to the different stakeholders as well. I think sometimes something we politicians can be guilty of, is a great idea comes to the table, and whatever happens, we are going ahead with that idea. But this is too big an issue for us to do that. We have to be listening to all of the stakeholders and coming up with a really comprehensive solution.
And Deborah, you were nodding there. You must recognise from your own time advising politicians on what people are concerned about, that it's a big difference between finding out what people think and then actually being able to address it.
Absolutely, and that's a question of kind of political will. And some of these are difficult issues. I mean, social care most obviously is incredibly difficult. Everybody acknowledges the need, but actually to find a way of delivering it, and more importantly, paying for it, is very much easier said than done. So, in a sense, I think what you need almost is to get a sort of national consensus behind some of these tricky and difficult issues. But again, easier said than done.
And on that particular note, I'd just like to bring in our first question from the audience. Alison True, hello Alison, thank you for joining us, asks, could we hear the panel's thoughts on how we square the fact that voters don't want to pay more tax with the fact that we urgently need reformed care? Deborah, let's continue with you on that one first, then we'll go around the rest.
Yeah, I mean, this is so hard. I mean, actually, one of my proudest moments in my career was working on, kind of introducing communications around what turned out to be the most popular tax rise ever, which was in the Labour government era, when, the NI tax rise that was, hypothecated for the NHS, which was it was unimaginable that any kind of tax rise could get 80% approval from the public, but it did. And it took quite a long time to kind of figure out how best to sort of broker that and make it work so that it became a popular thing rather than an unpopular thing. I mean, look, voters aren't stupid. In the end, they know that you don't get out for out. But they're so they so lack trust in politicians. They are so used to being, politicians over-promising and under-delivering that, they're very cynical about everything that they're told. And they also have often have quite a poor understanding, and why should they? They're getting on with their lives. They're not economists, but quite a poor understanding of what tax means and talking about large sums of money. I mean, just two examples of that. One is in the early days of the new Labour government, and some of you in the audience will be too young to remember this, there was this thing called the Dome, which Labour dug its heels in about continuing, even though it was becoming increasingly unpopular. And, basically voters felt it was a waste of money. It had cost a few million quid. Voters thought that money could be redeployed to completely renovate the NHS. Now, the reality was it wouldn't have refurbished one A&E probably, but people just had very little sense. And another example is asking people about tax rises. And I've had people quite often say, look, for the NHS, I'd be really happy to pay a penny more. When we dug a bit deeper, it turned out what they meant was like a penny more a year rather than a penny in every pound that they earned, which would have a very different implication for them. So it's, it's hard to sort of navigate this stuff. But I think in the end, it is about trying to be much more honest with the voter, and trying to almost what's needed is political and fiscal education to explain to people what you can get with what and what that looks like. But it's a very different kind of relationship, perhaps, from the one that this government has with the voter and many others.
Thank you. Yes, and particularly that idea, people in Westminster, I think, often used to throwing around the word billion without realising that actually once you're past the million, it gets, it becomes a bit boggling. Frankly, exactly. And then you say, when you consider how much the state spends overall on one day, you break it down into hours, and you realise actually a really large amount of money disappears extremely quickly if not allocated in the right way. I mean, Caroline, what's your perspective on Alison's question?
Yeah, it's a good question, isn't it? I mean, if there was a magic answer, someone would have found it by now. But I mentioned Andrew Dilnot before, and one of the things that he always points out is that actually to fix social care in this country really wouldn't cost a lot of money. We spend a tiny proportion on social care compared to the NHS, and yet the two systems are really very interdependent. And when things go on in social care, it just ups the bill in the NHS. So actually, I think there's quite a lot to learn from that. He might say, actually, we wouldn't necessarily need to raise taxation in order to make quite a big difference to social care. And you know, that's a conversation to have with the Treasury. But there is, you know, it's a good time to borrow money, basically, I think might be the point he was making. And actually, whatever you did to raise money, it would take quite a long time before that came through. If we followed the path of other countries, they pool the risk. What happens is you all pay a small amount extra, probably that penny, for example, that Deborah was referring to, through your wages and the salary every week through your working life. And then eventually, if you need care in later life, then it's there for you. And if you don't, that's fine. You know, sometimes you can use the money for something else instead. It depends how the scheme works. But other countries have done it, so I don't really see any reason why we wouldn't, particularly after the events of the last 6 months, where we've seen how very badly prepared care was for COVID, and that's partly because it really was, for example, totally understaffed to start with. So I think we owe social care something, and there's a need for some atonement, as I think James Forsyth has said in The Spectator.
Thank you. Dehenna, when people start talking about conversations with the Treasury, some MPs get excited about that. Some of them get a little bit gloomy about the prospect. But when in terms of voters in your constituency, what would their take be on Alison's question about how you square that circle?
Well, I think it's a real top question from Alison, and something that's very much on the minds of policymakers, and certainly on the minds of Treasury as ever. It's a really difficult one. I think you find with polling, when people are asked kind of yes/no questions, you tend to get very different answers to when they're asked them in a more nuanced and kind of contextual fashion. So if you were to ask people in my patch whether or not they'd be willing to pay a little bit more tax to help support the social care sector, I would imagine that the vast majority of people would say yes. But I think what a lot of people in my constituency would be more keen to know is that their tax money that they're already putting in is being spent well. We know that across the public sector there are huge inefficiencies, and that's something that we really, really need to address, I think personally, before we start talking about raising taxes. Having done my time in local government for a little while, I was astonished at some of the waste that I saw. People sitting around with no work to do for 4 days in a row, sitting reading a Harry Potter book because they hadn't been allocated any work and didn't think to ask for any. You just think this is madness. Now, I'm not saying that's going to solve the problem, but I think it's something that we certainly need to be thinking of before we start talking about raising taxes. And I think it's also important that we see that certainly, you know, people in my part of the world who tend to be on those lower incomes see that people are paying their fair share of taxes as well. So I'm really pleased that the government is taking strong measures to tackle tax evasion. I think that's really important. But I think it's also important that we do create an environment in which businesses are keen to come and invest in the UK. And I think actually in some ways, you know, lowering that corporation tax rate has been a really good thing because we've seen tax returns actually rise through that. So it's not always about increasing taxes per se, it's just about being very smart with how we use our tax system to make sure we're getting the biggest bang for our buck. I don't know that I've necessarily answered yours or Alison's question there, Mark, but there are my thoughts.
No, so thank you. And Deborah, you mentioned a word earlier that normally sets off screeching sirens over the Treasury, which is hypothecation.
Yeah.
People say, I'd be happy to pay a bit of extra tax for specific things, say social care, for example, as Caroline mentioned, or the health service. As you know, some of our listeners at home may not be quite so aware actually of how resistant politicians and policymakers are to hypothecation. The Treasury in particular hates the idea. Partially, I assume because if you gave everybody a little ballot paper with their tax return, Britain would have an even bigger NHS, a massively well-funded armed forces, probably larger police, but various other parts of the state would wither away because people wouldn't be aware or wouldn't necessarily be putting it as the top of things at the top of their list. You saw hypothecation happen for a particular tax for the NHS. Can you give us some insight into how that happened and whether you think it would be viable to possible to persuade again on something like social care?
Well, you know, as you rightly suggest, of course, the easy one is the NHS, because you go a long way to find anybody who won't say that they think it should be better funded. And frankly, that's even more true now than it was then. I mean, that was, you know, the British public have always had a love affair with the NHS. Any politician would sort of touch it, dabble with it, do anything negative to it at their peril. But that was long before we all stood on our doorsteps and sort of clapped it sort of every Thursday night and all the rest. So so in that sense, it was the easy bit. But even then, I mean, I was doing work for Gordon Brown and his team at the time. And as you say, I mean, everybody in the Treasury, including Gordon, was sort of rather horrified at the idea of ring fencing, which is basically what hypothecation is, saying, that money will go to that thing. But in the end, it was quite important in raising taxes and getting that sort of public thumbs up for raising taxes. And this was particularly difficult, by the way, for Labour, for a Labour government that had committed itself to not be profligate with voters' money, which was people's knee-jerk when they thought about Labour. So it was a tricky thing to negotiate, but promises had been made, and there was an eagerness not to do the traditional old thing of over-promising and under-delivering. I think the more concrete that you can be, the better. And as you say, I think one of those things is the public don't know a lot of the ways that their money is spent, but that doesn't mean to say that they would necessarily disagree if they did know. So, I mean, it makes a case actually, I think, for, and I'm a big fan of these, others less so I know, but things like sort of citizens' juries, citizens' panels, bringing people and involving ordinary members of the public in decision-making. I think in the end, that's the only way that you get a breakthrough, where you do what's called, you use a sort of deliberative, participative democracy, where you make sure that you enable people to fully participate in that policy debate by telling them the things they didn't know. Again, like so many things, this is easier said than done. And a lot of politicians don't like it because they think it takes away their power. But my feeling is it's the best route to handling those very tricky topics. And I think on something like social care, it's probably the only way forward.
Caroline, is there on that idea that Deborah raises, is there an appetite for that, or do people just want it sorted out? So the counter view would be that, well, we elect these people, why can't they just do it?
Well, quite soon after I started at Age UK, about 6 or 7 years ago now, we did do a citizens' jury on how to pay for social care. What was really interesting, and actually I think some of Deborah's guys were involved in organising it.
We were.
It was very interesting, and I was learning at that point. I still am. I learn every day, but I was learning. I was new to social care, so I listened with particular interest. And what happened was that to start with, they knew very little about social care. So it was over 2 days, I think, and the first day, various experts came and explained to them about social care and how it works at the moment. So by the end of the first day, this group of people, I think we're about 12 or 15 people, were absolutely outraged at how terrible it all was and how unfair it was to lots of people in our society. And then on the second day, they moved more into a discussion about how to pay for it. And my recollection about that was that actually they very much struggled with the question. It was too complicated, to be honest. It probably would have needed more time. And I remember one chap there in particular arguing very strongly against inheritance tax. On the whole, there was quite a lot of support for that in the group, but there was one chap there who felt very strongly. He'd built his own business. He wanted to hand it on to his children. And he thought it was absolutely outrageous, the thought that anybody might prevent him from doing that. And he swayed the rest of the group. I remember that very well. But I think that's just a demonstration of how difficult it is to get a consensus on such a very difficult and emotive issue, which of course hits different people in different ways. So, I might feel fine about inheritance tax, another person might not. So, I think it depends on our individual circumstances. But I think worth remembering that people in the Red Wall, going back to that, probably have less money. They have fewer assets to protect, and they have less income, and they don't have as many savings to fall back on. So for people in these areas, it's absolutely crucial that basically the state system is one they can rely on. And the sad matter of it is at the moment they can't. They are being badly let down, and lots of them aren't getting the help they need. And so they are living rather miserably in pain, with discomfort. They're more likely to be falling in their homes and ending up in hospital when it could have been avoided. And a better system would prevent that.
Is there a case for the kind of reverse argument that actually, rather than talking through the complexities of this with voters in, say, red wall seats, that actually part of the issue is that policymakers down in London, the home counties, in rather nice houses with well-supplied pensions and very few fears about their retirement, don't actually understand the challenges and the nature of life in some of these parts of the country, which they often might see from a distance on a train while heading to the Edinburgh Festival, but otherwise simply haven't been to, don't have an insight into.
Sorry.
No, well, I was going to say that I think that's absolutely, but I think that is one of the things that you can do with these sorts of programs, is to make sure that people who, of course, will only be able to come into it with their own experience, but to enable them to wear more of a citizen's hat by making it clear to them that the way they live isn't the way that everybody else lives.
So, Caroline, I think you were going to say something on that as well.
Well, I was just thinking, I think a lot does depend on constituency MPs like Dehenna, actually, and how in touch they are with their own local areas. And I know there's a lot of enthusiasm amongst the new intake of MPs, these new constituencies, to really be good local champions. And I'm sure she wouldn't mind me saying that a couple of years ago, I spent an hour with Theresa May in her constituency at her local Age UK, with a largest group of older people, all on tables. They were all involved in social care. They were either receiving it. There were some offspring there as well, some sons and daughters. And she sat and she listened really hard to, and she took part, and it was a very good hour. It's very kind of her to spend her time. But it was clear to me there she was very much a good local constituency MP. And, when she tried to put some policies through, it went rather badly wrong, as I'm sure I don't have to tell lots of the people listening to this. But nonetheless, actually listening to what your own constituents are telling you, I think is a huge thing here, and talking to your councillors as well. They know a lot about it.
So, Dehenna, is that how you see part of your role? You're in Westminster since that first journey down after the election that I mentioned earlier on, in part to teach people in Westminster, including people in your party and mine, a bit of a lesson about things that they currently don't, people and places and lives that they currently don't know enough about.
Well, I haven't necessarily viewed it as teaching them a lesson, but maybe I need to have that attitude. No, I mean,
would like to view it that way.
What was that? Sorry, Mark.
Your voters would like to view it that way.
Oh yeah, certainly. I think it's really important, and a lot of what I sort of pitched during the election was that, look, if I get elected, I'm not going to be London's voice here in the constituency. I'm going to be your voice in London, making the case for what it is that's affecting you and the things that you're concerned about. I think it's so important, particularly for a new MP, because there is a huge difference between either growing up somewhere, living somewhere, and then actually having the honour of being able to meet people right across every different sector of society and learn about the very diverse challenges that people in your community are facing. And particularly, in a lot of red wall seats, where some of our seats actually have quite a lot of diversity within the seat. So mine, for example, I've got wonderful, leafy, more middle-class villages, and then, former mining and railway towns, which have got incredibly different challenges. And so your job as an MP is to understand that and to go and actually engage, or that's certainly how I view my role. So during the election, I was out talking to people in a whole different range of environments. I ran a series of pub conversations so I could go and talk to people a bit more informally about what was on their mind, in places where people tend to hang out rather than, booking a town hall and doing it that way in a slightly more unnatural fashion. And now, we're still running surgeries despite COVID. We're doing virtual surgeries. I do Zoom calls with, teaching groups, with charities, with as many people as I can, because it's important that as the local MP, I know what's going on and I know what's on people's minds. And then, you do try and bring that here to Parliament. And sometimes I must admit, you can feel like a little bit of a lonely voice until you start talking to other colleagues and learn that actually right across our communities, no matter how diverse our constituencies are, there are people facing those same challenges right across the country. And that's when we get some excellent campaigns. So, for example, I've been not quite related to older voters, but incredibly impressed with my colleague in Rutland and Melton, Alicia Kearns, and the campaign she's run to kind of encourage NHS trusts to allow pregnant women to have someone with them for their scans and for their births, which was kind of kicked a little bit during COVID and is now kind of coming back into force. It's those sort of impacts that we can have on people's lives, real tangible impacts. But first we need to listen and we need to learn and we need to know what it is that people are concerned about and the challenges they're facing.
And when Deborah mentioned earlier that in her research, a lot of what people wanted when they voted to change, often for the first time in their lives, to change party, last December was a demand to be heard, was a test of the control they'd been told has been taken back, to see whether it was the chance that they were going to have a voice and they were going to use it. Obviously, they expect that of you. And when you're listening to them and then you're coming to Westminster to communicate that message, presumably, or actually, well, I'm not going to presume, what kind of listening ear do you find in government? Are the departments, the ministers, the party, are they taking on board that this is not a job done, but an opportunity, a window of opportunity? Or what kind of answer do you get?
I mean, I completely believe that they are. Sometimes you'll go to them with a very, very specific, tiny policy, and sometimes it can be hard to get that through. But I think the broader notion that what we really need to be doing is levelling up, and I know it's one of those awful buzz phrases, but just excuse me for using it. The fact that we really need to deliver in some of these communities that have felt left behind far too long, where the Conservative Party's never really had much of a foothold, where the Labour Party, or they feel the Labour Party never really delivered for them. It's absolutely crucial, and I know that colleagues right across government are listening to that. But that's part of the reason that I joined the Levelling Up Task Force, just to make sure that, as policy emerges over the next few months and few years, that we have got that voice sort of from the backbenchers, just saying, look, we really need to focus on this, we need to focus on delivering. Much of my pitch during the election was, look, you've had the same old for decades now and you say things haven't got any better. Give me a chance. Give me a chance, try something new, see if things change. And if things don't change, vote me out in 5 years' time. But I know that pressure is on my shoulders and on the shoulders of all of the new intake to actually make those changes and to deliver. And I'm pretty confident with some of our loud mouths that government will listen and will deliver.
Yeah, I remember when I mentioned the 2004 referendum, I remember doing a debate back then in County Durham, which the Yes campaign said, if you have a regional assembly in the North East, then Westminster will have to listen to us. And someone in the back of the audience shouted, the Prime Minister represents down the road. And that was part of the point. You had a cabinet where a chunk of them were in North East seats, and their argument was regionalisation will make Westminster listen to you, which implied we haven't been listening so far. Can I bring in an audience question? Darius Hutchinson asks, should we have a fund specifically for the north of England? And I'd like to bring Caroline in on this, because this is part of the issue, I suppose. It must be a bit of a concern, I suppose, to a certain extent, is that there is an opportunity to talk about some of these communities and older voters in some of these communities who perhaps have been politically neglected. But a purely regional solution doesn't solve this, a generational issue.
Yeah, I suppose, coming from a national organisation, as you'd expect, I would argue for national solutions that are locally implemented. I mean, maybe if I was an MP in your area, I might argue for something rather different. But actually, in many ways, although the older voters in the red wall areas are a bit less well off, incomes are tighter, and all the other differences that I explained, they might have exactly the same issues as, say, somebody living in Harlow in Essex, or somewhere else that in a different part of England, which just doesn't happen to be, frankly, the southeast, which is the most affluent in many ways. So, the other way around of thinking about that is, if you get it right for people in the red wall, then you'll get it right for loads and loads of other people who just don't happen to live there, but have very similar views and interests and needs right across England, to a degree right across the UK. Even that's many of these issues resonate just as strongly in the other three nations as well.
Deborah.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on a few of the things that have been points that have been made, because they relate so strongly to the what I heard when I was chatting to people for the book. The first is the point about representation, which Dehenna talked about, and I think you talked about as well, which is that one of the things that I heard a lot in the Red Wall, I think it was particularly true actually in the North East, was this sense that what Labour had done was to sort of appoint their favoured sons, and it did tend to be sons as it happened, into the seat. And, so think David Miliband, obviously Tony Blair, come to that. But there was also Tristram Hunt in Stoke. There were quite a few of these individuals who were very effective and impressive people, but basically got the seat, looked south, kind of never looked back. And I think that's one of the things that people have felt incredibly resentful about. But the other thing they do feel resentful about is this north-south, Midlands-south, you know, feeling that they have been dealt an unfair hand. And I think there's a real watch out here for this government, because the term levelling up is not known by people. Why would they? The concept that lies behind it does not, when you tell people about it, actually fit the, I mean, they don't find it credible as a solution. I think there's a really important point to make here, and I'm not quite sure how this is resolved, but it's incredibly important to know it's a problem, because if it isn't solved, there will be massive disappointment. And that is that people see the scarcity of resource that they have had compared with what they see as an abundance in other places, most notably London, but lots of southern constituencies. They see it as a zero-sum game. Basically, what they believe is that their place can't get better unless those other places get worse. Now, I realise this is an incredibly unattractive proposition for politicians to deal with, because nobody wants to say, hey, London, you've had it great for a long time. And of course, not everywhere in London has. We're going to take some of your money and give it to these guys. But logically, that is what they believe has to happen. So it's a very, very, very difficult thing to grapple with. And levelling up does not cut it for people. I mean, it's particularly difficult because, just to Caroline's point finally, is that actually, of course, the Red Wall, as a group of constituencies, have some particular issues, but they are not that dissimilar from lots of other places. I mean, Harlow, I think Caroline just mentioned, another very, you know, kind of quite run-down place that, even though of its proximity to London, it's still, you know, there are lots of similar attitudes. Cornwall is another great example where, you know, a lot of those kind of very run-down seaside towns in Cornwall are quite like the Red Wall, and they don't have a decent Marks and Spencer either. So, you know, it's a tricky one, but actually people do believe it's a zero-sum game. They don't think things can get better for them unless it gets worse for someone else.
Dehenna, can I bring you in response to that before you talk about the big question of whether you'd like a fund specifically for your constituency, which I can probably guess the answer.
No, I think, Deborah, you made some really important points there, particularly in the sense that it's not just a north-south divide, it runs a lot deeper than that. And you're right, I think we need to try and not kind of segregate things in our minds in that sort of way. Sure, we know that a lot of the Red Wall seats, for example, did tend to be towards the north, but actually you're exactly right that some of the challenges faced in places like Cornwall are actually in some ways very similar to the challenges faced in towns like Bishop Auckland. So we need to never lose sight of that. So a fund for the north of England, I think people might be surprised to hear me say that actually it's probably not something that I would necessarily favour. I mean, we've already got Northern Powerhouse Minister who's kind of focusing on kind of driving growth in the north. We've already got the prospect of devolution deals whereby local communities can benefit from that if we sort of merge our councils, and we see the great success of that, particularly in Tees Valley with Mayor Ben Houchen, who has done some incredible things since he was elected back in 2017 without ever needing a fund specifically for the north of England. And also, as a northerner, I'm not going to lie, it does feel incredibly patronising to hear Westminster say, there, northerners, there's a little pot of money to help you get by. What I would much rather see is good national policy that's actually going to deliver for people right across my constituency, right across left behind towns and villages in the north. And I think sometimes tying together that national policy, particularly on things like infrastructure, is incredibly important as well. And being able to sell that to the public. So I haven't always made myself very popular, for example, with my views on HS2 as a project. You know, I love infrastructure spending, I love that sort of investment, but it's a very difficult thing for me to sell to my constituents, saying we're going to spend over £100 billion on a train you're probably never going to get on, but actually you can't get a bus from village to village within the constituency. So I just think we need to be a little bit more mindful when we're coming out with these infrastructure projects about the impacts on everyday people's lives in some of these left behind communities.
I'd just like to ask you, and then Deborah very quickly, is there part of an issue here where the South's idea of where the north is different to where the north knows the north is, particularly when you go to the northeast, for example? You know, where I come from, in North Tyneside, HS2 going to Sheffield is not a project that really goes to the north. For me personally, the north begins when you leave York Station. But for some policymakers in Westminster, the north means Derby. I once heard someone describe Lincoln as the north, which felt like particularly like a stretch. Do you think is that part of the issue, that actually there's a bit of a geographical... I also should say I heard some Conservative MPs who campaigned in some northern seats in England the last election, who said, "Gosh, I hadn't realised till I got there how big it is." That's literally a quote. And actually, is that part of the problem here? Is people actually finding out more about their own country?
I think so, but then again, I would never presume to be an expert on the Southwest, for example. So I think it's about we as the Northern MPs kind of coming down here and shouting nice and loudly, encouraging people to come and visit. And what I think I would like to see, really, particularly from like the civil service, are a lot more kind of visits out into the country. I know with COVID at the moment it's very difficult, but maybe some kind of scheme where if you're going to go and work for a particular government department that's going to be, you know, having impacts on parts of the country that you've never been to, having people actually go and see it for themselves, I think could be a really, really worthwhile thing. Because I was amazed the amount of people who came up from parts further south to come and campaign for me in the election, who'd arrive and they go, "Oh my gosh, it's really pretty up here, isn't it?" And I'm like, yes, it is. The North is a very diverse place. I can show you some great places, some less great places, but thank you for coming. Now let's go crack on. And I think that attitude, we really need to break that attitude. And that's partly down to us as MPs, but also partly down, I think, to government as well.
Deborah, then Caroline.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, to be honest, I think it cuts both ways. I absolutely agree with what Jenna's just said, but I also think, you know, a lot of the people that I spoke to when I was doing the research for my book had never been to London. Or if they had, they'd maybe been on a weekend trip with their family to go sightseeing once in their lives. So, you know, that there is a sense of otherness. I mean, for a very small country, we're quite a divided country, I think, and you know, quite siloed. And actually, just finally on HS2 as well, I would absolutely echo what's been said. It absolutely was not seen as any kind of positive solution. Huge cynicism I found in the Red Wall about that massive expenditure. And all that they could see was that it would help people in London to get around the country more easily, but it wouldn't help them. So for instance, in Accrington, Hyndburn, one of the places where I did a sort of deep dive piece of research for the book, you know, Accrington is just 20 odd miles away from Manchester. It takes an hour and 20 minutes on the train. It is unbelievable. So, you know, people can't get around, can't move. One of the people I interviewed, a retired butcher, his son had moved to Manchester, and he talked about it as sadly as if he'd moved to Australia. You know, he felt he was never going to see him again because he was so far away. He was 20 miles away. In London, if you were 20 miles outside London, you could be there in 10 minutes from almost any place.
And Caroline, you mentioned some of that earlier in terms of some services in social care and services for older people simply not being available in a person's local area. And when you're talking about some of the facts and figures Deborah was mentioning earlier about people being very locally rooted, people having obviously want to keep connections to their communities and their families, that question of accessing care, or either not being able to access it, or if you are able to access it, doing it at the price of being uprooted and, you know, divorced from what network you do have around you, must make issues like loneliness and so on even worse.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we certainly know at the moment, not just in the Red Wall, but right across the country, quite often if you are lucky enough to qualify for some state help with your social care bills, it's quite possible your council will say, well, we found you somewhere that we can afford to send you to, but actually, unfortunately, it's 80 miles away. And that means, or there's somewhere else that's very near, but, you know, maybe the family doesn't think it's good enough. And care is rather patchy in our country. So, I mean, that leaves families and older people in a terrible position of trying to decide whether they really do want to have care that's going to be way out of the sort of distance that family could typically visit on a daily basis. Of course, at the moment, lots of people aren't being able to visit at all, but in the normal sort of day-to-day life, then a lot of people are very reliant on having family come and visit them in a care home. And if that's practically impossible for them, it's, you know, it does make life very, very difficult. So yes, I mean, the people everywhere, I think, right across the country, want good local services. It makes such an enormous difference. And lots of chat at the moment about the NHS using online methods and digital and all of that. But most over 75s, for example, aren't online in this country. They're not smartphone users. They wouldn't be able to take advantage of that. What they could take advantage of, though, is if the consultant takes his or her clinic out of the hospital into their GP surgery once a month, for example, So I think there's lots more scope for taking services closer to where people are. And almost everybody in later life wants to age at home. They don't really want to go into a care home unless they have to. So the more we can bring services closer to them, the better. And that's good for everybody.
And on a related note, there's another question from the audience. Vasco Basak asks, which people or organisations can eliminate inefficiencies in the NHS and social care system, such as people staying in hospitals longer due to no care at home? Caroline, what's your experience?
Well, on that one, that's not so much, well, that is a structural problem, which is the lack of social care. So what happens is that it's all too easy for people to have to go into hospital. As I say, sometimes with better care, you'd avoid that. And then when they get there, quite often they become this terrible phrase, bed blockers, which obviously we don't use at Age UK, but is used in the popular press. They get stuck in hospital. It's not their fault, but they're dependent on there being good social care back in the community so that they can move out again. And the answer to that is simply having a properly resourced, properly funded, and organised social care system, which we absolutely don't have at the moment. We have a hodgepodge of services, and we don't have enough of them all. Some of them are in the wrong places. And there are areas which we call social care deserts, and I'm sure there are some in the Red Wall, where even if you've got money to pay for care, there's just no one there to provide it, because we're paying people less than they'd get for being on the checkout at Aldi. So where there is buoyant job market in particular, people are often choosing not to work in social care. Whether that COVID is going to change that, we'll have to see. But there are more than 120,000 vacancies in care today and every day. So that's a lot more people we've got to find.
Going to be a lot more when we come out of Europe.
And that's going to help. That's not going to help too. It probably won't make that much difference in the Red Wall, but it will make a big difference in London, for example, in Manchester, in Leeds, I think, as well. Some of the cities where, in London, for example, 1 in 5 of all care workers have come from the EU. So in future, instead of actually making this better, that threatens to make it worse.
I'll tell you, I've got a question on that. I'll put to Dehenna in just a moment, but I was going to ask you, Caroline, there's a risk, isn't there, of a kind of vicious feedback loop where if the NHS, if people, when they need care in a hospital, are then discharged to a social care system that isn't able to support them and keep them in good health, or isn't able to provide the support for them, that they then are more likely to end up back in hospital, their health declines further, and the demands on the social care system become worse. The analogy that springs to mind from another event I did a couple of days ago, actually, is the disconnect between, say, the prison system and probation, where if a prison fails on rehabilitation, the probation system's job gets harder, that people reoffend, they go back into prison, and so on and so on. Has the merger of health and social care in Whitehall made any difference?
Not much, I think. Most people would honestly say, not yet. But that's what we need to do, at least for older people. It might be different. Older people aren't the only people who use social care. Lots of younger people with disabilities use it as well. And for them, the tie-up with health may be less important. But for older people, who almost always are needing care because their health is declining, getting joined up services, just coming to them in a very organised way, whether it's whether it's a district nurse or whether it's a carer coming to help them wash during the day, getting those working well together is really, really important. And it's not really where we are at the moment. The NHS has made moves to improve the kind of community services that older people receive, because they definitely need improving at the moment. But social care is still not joined up enough. And at the same time, when I mentioned the problem with the workforce, we've got all these vacancies in social care, and we're trying to create more nursing roles, we're trying to expand the NHS workforce. If you go and do a social care job for the NHS, you get paid considerably more than if you just do it in care. Those people who work in hospitals, who are called healthcare assistants, are basically social carers, but they're paid a lot more and the terms and conditions are better than if they worked in care. So really, that's just an obvious example of where we ought to have one workforce strategy for the whole of the NHS and the whole of social care. And that's really just a microcosm of what needs to happen more generally. We do need a much more integrated, joined up system.
Dehenna, could I get your opinion on that, but also perhaps whether you'd like to reply to that point that was made about Brexit? Because we talked earlier about the tension between people not wanting taxes to be higher, but wanting money to be spent. There is a tension, if we're talking about a seat like yours, where which is sometimes pointed to where people voted leave, but they may need an immigration system after Brexit that can help the supply of care workers. Was there anything you'd like to say in response to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously in the sort of short to potentially medium term, this is something that's very concerning for the social care sector. I think it's something like 1 in 11 roles are live vacant or something along those lines, which is mad. I suppose the benefit of us leaving the EU is that we then have the power to set our own immigration policy, and we've taken the immigration bill through Parliament. I understand at the moment that the sort of salary threshold probably wouldn't be, that the criteria probably wouldn't be met for many care workers, but the beauty is it's then for our government to decide what particular sectors would be exempt from that salary threshold. So we could determine that the social care sector was a sort of shortage occupation, and could then have care workers exempt from the sort of standard rules, which means that they'd still be able to come here and work if they chose to. So I think it's really important. The fact of the matter is Brexit means that we will have control of our own immigration policy, and I think that's a really important thing. And then it's for government to get that right, and for us to make the case for sectors like the care sector to make sure that the government do get that right. I think that's the key thing. And obviously, in the sort of slightly longer term, what we need to be really doing is firstly probably encouraging more people to see working as a carer as a more viable longer term career choice. But secondly, making sure that our care workers really do feel valued. Part of that means looking at the salaries that are paid, because as we know, most care workers do tend to be on or around the minimum wage for what can be some very difficult work. I know my great aunt is a carer, and sometimes she doesn't feel the most valued. So it's about that, but it's also making sure that kind of across the board, we've got the right incentives in place for people on low incomes. And that means things like continuing to look at income tax thresholds so people can keep more of the money that they're earning, and those sorts of measures too.
Thank you. Deborah, how does that paradox come across on the doorstep? When people are talking about, say, the net immigration, the total immigration figures that they see, or the trends in immigration that they feel in their day-to-day lives, how easy or difficult is it to say, well, that may be the case in total, but can you appreciate the need in one sector or another?
I think it is a case that can be made. I mean, there's another way of doing it, which is to pay care workers more, and there might be another way of addressing the economy. And certainly, if you ask people people are very keen that something good comes out of COVID, right? They really want. We've been through this. We are going through this absolutely horrendous sort of turmoil. It's resetting everything. And, most people don't want us to return to how we were before. Only 9% do. And when you ask what are the changes they want to see, one of the things they want to see is greater valuing of people that are working in those sorts of sectors. That means paying them more. And I mean, it's a sort of, it's an accident of history that we've ended up valuing certain things. I really recommend David Goodhart's new book, Head, Hands, Heart, or maybe it's the other. I might not have got the order of those things right, but it's about how we've ended up in this strange situation where people who work with their head are valued so much more highly than people who work with their hands, or people who are carers working with their hearts, as he puts it. And I think there's something there that would play very well in the Red Wall. I mean, it's it's about a different kind of industrial policy, and it's about valuing different sectors in a different way. That would solve the problem without having to worry about immigration.
So I'm aware, ladies and gentlemen, that time is fleeting, and so I'm going to go to one last question, which is a really simple question with probably massive answers. We'll get to the nub of what we're talking about, just to warn the panel. We'll go Deborah first, then Dehenna, then we'll finish.
Oh, great.
And then it's from an anonymous attendee who doesn't want to blame me for asking this. If there was one policy change the government could make to benefit older voters in the Red Wall before the next election, what would you recommend it to be, Deborah?
Well, I think it would be about actually getting something happening with social care. And it would have as part of it what I've just been talking about, which is better pay, which would make a big difference, not just for older people, but for everybody in the Red Wall. As I said, I met so many of the women that I met were working in multiple jobs, were really struggling to make ends meet, doing several caring jobs because they couldn't afford not to. So it's about better quality care and better funded care.
Dehenna.
For fear of alienating a lot of my kind of small state Tory colleagues, I think I can certainly see an argument to take social care out of local government and make a centralised social care body actually that provides social care in a similar way to that which the NHS does, rather than being run through local councils. I think it'd mean there's some standardisation across the board and probably better ability to have some of those larger conversations about how social care should look moving into the future.
Caroline, can we get your thoughts on that idea and then your own answer to the question, please?
Yeah, I agree with both the previous two speakers. I think there's a bit of a kind of under the counter conversation going on about should social care become part of the NHS. It doesn't have to become part of the NHS, but it does need to move closer to it, especially for older people. As I've said, it might be a different solution for younger people, young learning disabled people, for example, for whom coming out of children's services, which councils run, and then needing support is a really, really important transition. And councils have a huge role to play there. A lot of their budget on social care actually goes on that. But as I've said, for older people, it's a very different business, really. It's about supporting people, usually in the last few years of their lives, as they've got increasing infirmity. And for that, getting it right with the NHS is crucial. And I think there's a health bill going to be coming through Parliament quite soon, which is going to give more oversight, we expect, to integrated care systems, which is a bit of jargon, which basically is a system, basically is an organisation that brings together health and care in local areas, but has much more direct link back into Westminster, into ministers, than currently there is in social care. I know that one of the things that ministers have found very frustrating, health ministers, is that when they tried to help social care through the pandemic, they've had to do it through councils and they haven't had a direct route to doing it. And this would give them a more direct route, and that would be good for accountability. And I'd like that, because I want ministers to feel the pressure of the need to improve social care because of the impact it has on millions and millions of people. But basically, if we could have the two things that Deborah and Dehenna said, I'd be a very happy person. And they are within the government's power to do, and many other countries have done them before us, sometimes a generation ago. So it's about time we caught up.
Marvellous. Well, thank you very much. What a note, a crucial note to end on. And thank you to all of you at home around the country for viewing this on Zoom and on the Party Conference platform. Thank you for your questions. Thank you, of course, to our wonderful panellists for really getting such a deep insight into this topic. By no means the end of this conversation, but the start of several more conversations, certainly. Deborah Mattinson, Caroline Abrahams and Dehenna Davison, thank you very much for being so generous with your time and your expertise. I'd like to thank, on behalf of Conservative Home Age UK, for working with us to make this event possible. If you'd like to watch it again, if you'd like to share it with friends and family, or for that matter, with your councillor or your MP, it'll be going up on the Conservative Home YouTube channel shortly and going up on Conservative Home website as well. We'll be back with our next event at 3:30 on a not unrelated issue, an event with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, talking about a new generation of good jobs for an economic recovery that would help all of us. So I hope I'll see you then. If not, we'll see you soon. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.